Alright, so here we go with the modeling lecture for GA4 Portfolio 4. Just to give you a little bit of an advantage for modeling, some advanced tutorials, some advanced techniques that we use here in this production for hard surface modeling and for any other kind of modeling that you're interested in. Um, I'm going to run through some of this to try to get you to understand what we're working with. I will probably load up and review my high-res model inside Sketchfab as well, as I show off a lot of techniques in that model, particularly to let you see what I'm doing. Um, so this is just a quick tutorial I've kind of thrown together to help give you that little extra advantage there. Um, and like I said, I've posted a link to my high-res mesh at the bottom of this page so that you can kind of follow along with this and see firsthand what I'm doing with my high-res mesh in order for me to get a bake from on my game res mesh as normal information. So that's the workflow that we're working with. If it's a little unclear for you, we are modeling the high-res mesh without UVs in order to bake normal map detail onto the game res mesh that is UV'd. And that high res mesh is smooth. The game res mesh should not be smoothed. We are modeling for silhouette with the game res mesh, so we're looking for geometry to influence that silhouette. Um, any wasteful or unused geometry in that silhouette will be should be optimized and taken down as low as you can get, with consideration to how balanced your geometry is and well laid out. So please try to be understanding, try to be clean with your modeling. I'm gonna run through some things here. Something you may have already dealt with or you might be new to is the insert edge loop with the edge flow function. So if I create something like a torus here, make it really low, hopefully. Polytorus. If I go to this torus and I use my features here to adjust, not the section radius, but the radius itself. It's actually how many divisions I want. There we go. So just to give you an example of an asset that I'm using here, inserting your edge loop with the edge flow. So I have insert edge loop here. If you look at the options in your toolbox, you may see this insert with edge loop option right here. This is an on and an off switch. Like once you leave this on, it stays on until you click off of it. Inside Maya, you can use this function just by holding the Shift key with your insert edge loop. But here you'll see that I'm inserting an edge loop, holding the Shift key. Once I release it, it rounds out the geometry with the flow that you might expect something to be smoothed with. So that's a feature I recommend using. If I don't hold the Shift key, that's how my inserted edge loops look. If you go to the options, you can click it on and off to have a more manual feature, but I recommend using just the quick link of Shift for a more feasible feature that's a little more optimized. Okay, so that's the Insert Edge Loop tool. I'm going to move over here to my next tool. Insert Edge Loop with Edge Flow. Now I want to go over the Slide Edge Loop tool. So many of you might not have dealt with this, and what I like to do with this feature is this helps me even out my geometry, space things out so that things are not so clumped together. Let's say, for instance, you have a holding edge right here, for instance, that is just too close to it, just too close for comfort there. Maybe I'll make another one right here. Now with this slide edge loop tool, I'm gonna show it to you right here. It's in the shift click options. Right down here to slide edge tool. You may be able to find it also. Oh boy. You may also be able to find it. I believe it's in your mesh tools. Yeah, mesh tool slide edge. But here's what the tool does. If I click this tool, you'll notice I have a new icon that says drag the MMB to slide, which is your middle mouse button. So if I click my middle mouse button and drag it, it slides that geometry around with the curvature of the model. So this kind of goes along the same realm of your insert edge loop tool with the shift option. So this respects the edge flow as much as possible. So let's say, for instance, this holding edge is a little bit too intense for me and I want to soften it out. I can slide my edge loop around a little bit to maybe unharden this edge, or go the opposite direction and harden the edge up a bit. Okay. Now, something you'll notice, once you complete this feature and let go of that option, let me undo this real quick. Once you make your move and let go of this feature, if you click on it again, you lose that curvature. So it respects where it was, and then it resets and tries to do something new. Okay? So make sure if you are sliding your edge loops around that you respect it the first time. Try to get it as good as possible and then release it or undo the operation to get that. So that's a slide edge loop tool to help you balance out your geometry, even out the spaces, or maybe even tighten up one of your bevels or holding edges. And like I said before, your high-res mesh is the only mesh you should have holding edges, maybe even bevels are nice to have for the game mesh to sort of smooth some stuff out for silhouette or for normal map baking situations. But holding edges serve no purpose in the game mesh at all, besides maybe adding some even geometry in there, which most likely it's not doing if it's very close up to the other edge. So holding edges is not something you want to have in your game res mesh. Buffer holding edges is the next, not an official term by the way, but just another way to kind of explain how holding edges work. I'm going to delete this one here, and I'm going to pull out a cylinder. And if I create, I'm going to put a holding edge here at the bottom just to kind of preserve that one. And then I'm going to put a holding edge right here to kind of give me a little bit of a roundness to work off of here. So we see that as I smooth and put this thing in the 3 mode, 3 mode is just a presentation of what the smooth operation is going to do to your model and how it's going to smooth it out. As you can see here, this produced a fairly soft effect right here, and it's not really giving me an edge. And the reason behind that is this smoothing operation, by hitting the 3 key, we have all of this room to roam free. That edge loop has all of this room in here to roam free, to relax a little bit. You see how much it's moving. That's a lot of movement and a lot of control that you're giving that edge loop and not giving to yourself. A buffer holding edge is an edge loop that creates another holding edge for that holding edge. It's very simple and easy. If I add another edge loop in there, then now all this edge loop has is this smaller region to create that holding edge and to soften up, as opposed to the other way. This is an important technique if you're looking to do, if I do my slide edge tool here, close up my gap. This is a good technique if you're looking to do metals, something that has a very sharp edge but still needs to be rounded out a bit, is to have a holding edge for that holding edge to really preserve how far it is softening. Okay? We do highly recommend that you try to bevel what you can, okay? It's more optimized and more useful for you to be creating bevels like this, and using those techniques to really round your stuff out. But if you are kind of in a bind, this is a way to kind of just smooth things out for you. So that's the buffer holding edges technique. Moving right along. Crease of separation is really kind of just like a preference and a way to display your model. Something you may see here in my model is the crease of separation is something that I want to show. I want people to show how that asset was assembled. If something's going into something, there needs to be a crease there. There needs to be a hole that it's going into. You know, and it also creates a situation where I'm creating separate pieces of the model, which helps out with my edge flow a lot. If I had geometry, transferring all through this stuff, then it would create a lot of unnecessary areas that won't help out my model in any way. The more separated you make your model, the more control you have over that one little area without it affecting the rest of your model. So creating situations like this right here, where I kind of modeled this separation in my handle here, is very efficient, and this information will bake into your normal maps for your game mesh. So what we're looking for is for you to make this, one piece in your game mesh, but separating it as much as possible, creating these creases. It may be hard to see, but this crease is also coming along this way, since this whole panel right here comes off so that you can get inside there. However, this one is smoothly fused in as it's created in the reference. But having and another situation for crease of separation is to have situations where we have like a slight bevel on pieces that are resting on top of other pieces. We're looking for little creases to create shadows that give people information about how this model is put together and what it looks like. It's a very subtle detail, but people really notice it, and it really makes your model stand out a lot better once you take that information and bake it into your normal maps. So most of this information for crease of separation is mostly going to be baked into your normal maps, and you have the opportunity to optimize your model with the game mesh portion of it. So in this example, I have this nut basically sitting on top of this surface, so I'm getting a crease of separation of something resting on top of something else, but I'm also getting, for this situation, like a button, a crease of separation that shows that this button is being inserted into the surface and not resting on top of the surface. So please show off your creases of separation properly and make them. And I'll give you techniques to help make that a lot easier so you're not modeling holes inside of everything to make this crease of separation. Okay, booleans. You guys are allowed to do booleans this month. It's not something that we should never have said no to. We should have just said not yet. You should not be using Boolean unless you properly know how to do the Boolean. For this situation in our game mesh, or for a high mesh, the way that I recommend students and artists do Booleans is to wait till the very end of your model, when you have successfully smoothed that model out, to actually create the Boolean in that situation when you do have enough geometry to support that Boolean. You'll see the difference between my booleans here, where I take my unsmooth mesh and my smooth mesh, and you'll see the difference in the quality here, where we have unmatching geometry, so geometry that doesn't match up with each other, geometry that's creating a faceted silhouette, so I'm getting like a rigid display there. You'll see it a lot better once in the lecture if you load that up. But you'll see that there's a lot of jagged lines. It's not doing a good enough job smoothing and curving that model out as much as this one is with the proper geometry and the stuff in place there. Please also take notes of which technique of Boolean you're using, because in some situations you may be better leaving the shape in there, but other situations may be more beneficial for you to just use the Boolean as a cutout tool and for you to actually extrude information into that with the hole that you've made. So there are some techniques that allow you to just cut out a shape instead of leaving the remainder of the geometry in there, which is what this one is doing, where I had a cylinder that I stabbed into a sphere and the remainder of the geometry stayed in there. However, it may be more optimized for me to use that Boolean to just cut the hole in there and then extrude in so I have cleaner geometry that allows me to have more control over it. So there are benefits to each of those workflows, and you may need to use either of those techniques this month. In my high-res mesh, I have a few examples of some Booleans that I've made. In this situation, maybe not enough geometry, where I'm getting a little bit of a faceted edge there that I've kind of cleaned up. But maybe in this situation, these were all Booleans right here that I modeled in and used and baked normal maps for in my game mesh. With situations like this right here, where I have a very specific shape that needs to be cut out, that exceeds a little bit past what I can extrude into my model. This hole was Booleaned, these ridges were Booleaned, these holes were Booleaned, and these holes were Booleaned. So just an idea of what you can do with the Boolean tool, what's available to you. It is a last step process though, and I don't recommend trying to use this Boolean until you have smoothed your mesh. And please, when you're picking your shapes to Boolean this thing into the other thing, please make sure you smooth the first shape enough so that the geometry fairly matches up as close as you can with the rest of the geometry. You may want to have a specific density to that shape that you're cutting into the other shape. Okay, inflation. There are a few ways to go about this in Maya. The first way may be a little more difficult, and I'll show you here in a minute. I'm going to take our favorite shape in the world, the awesome and spectacular helix tool. You guys all use this every day. I know you do. Don't lie. I'm gonna bring the radius down so we see what we're doing here. Now, please use the functions of your basic shapes to your advantage, and use as many basic shapes as you can when you're making your model, when you're blocking things out. Try not to think about drawing polygon to polygon as much as you would just using the basic shapes and connecting those shapes together in specific ways to make the model more useful, to try to keep the same geometry there and the same mechanical perfection that Maya makes. So we have these features off to the side whenever you make a basic shape, but right now I'm going to negate that just to show you how I can do this tool. So if I wanted to, let's say for instance I wanted to put a taper to a thickness on this. I'm gonna do a smooth or this thing's set to surface. I'm gonna do a soft select for surface. Here we go. So now if I increase my brush, I have a very radially built up coil here. If I wanted to do an inflate on this, I could. Me being in the vertice mode right now, ooh, that was weird. What I can do is I can come over to my transform tool and I can adjust my orientation to the normal function, which is a little risky and it gives you some weird things, but just bear with me here. Now you'll notice that my transform has changed. I no longer have X, Y, and Z. I now have N, U, and V. You guys know what UVs are. Why you would want to model along those is beyond me, but I'm sure it's possible. But what's interesting is this end handle right here. If you pull it out, it is moving the vertices along the end axis, along the normals of each of those vertices. So that's an inflate that you can do there. Please note that you do have to revert this back to object or world or whatever orientation you're using for any other feature to work, because you'll lose your you'll lose your handle um, if you leave it on normals and it has no normals to select. Okay, so that's one way of going about that. I'm going to undo it. Another way to do this is you have another technique down here and tool called the transform component. You guys know you have that special handle when you extrude something that gives you the very specific orientation for those faces. Transform component is exactly that. It's the tool that you get after you extrude something. Where I have my vertices here, you may see that I also don't have the soft select option available to this one. But you see that these vertices that I've selected, I can move those along their normals and inflate them around. Okay, this is a great technique if you need to get that orientation together again. To make sure you have that orientation there that you need, you can use that tool, transform component, and get the orientation that you need to inflate your model and to move things around to where they're pointed. Another technique that I've found that's not actually in the lecture is do you guys know, we should have probably picked up how to adjust the pivot with the D key, right? So you can move your pivot around with the D key and get a specific orientation to move your models around, right? As I was playing around with this the other day, I realized that if you hold the D key, you have some selection features as well. You'll see how it's highlighting things. Should I want to move and extend this thing around, I can hold my D key and select my face, and it will reorient my orientation to match up with the way that that face is directed. So I can now pull this thing longer or extend this thing out. If I wanted to pull this thing on its axis, its face normal, I can hold D and select that face, and now I have an extrusion feature here that lets me orient to that face. Pretty useful technique. I'm not sure if it's widely advertised, but it's there. So that's the reorient is what I'll kind of explain it as. And this works with edges and vertices as well. If you want to align something to a vertice normal, you can. And now that whole face is moving along with that vertice normal. Okay, great. And then you also have the option to, once again, if you need to reorient things, I think that's only a temporary orientation. So as you select that face again, that orientation resets, and you'll have to hold that D key and reset the orientation to get it to the right place that you want it to be again. I don't think that saves. So it's really just a translation technique, but you do still have your axis orientations to reset things back to object and normals and world. Okay, that is the transform tools that I have for you for inflation. It is another way that you can also create a cage, which I might explain later on down the road. But basically, a cage is like a handmade envelope that will allow you to extend and to deflate certain envelopes, so you have more control over some of your baking features inside of Substance and whatever tool you're using. So should you need a tighter envelope in certain areas of your bake and a wider envelope in other areas, you could export the model again as a cage, and it will create a man-made envelope for you inside Substance and other tools. A little bit more advanced, but it's something that you might want to research into if you're, for instance, not even able to use Substance in the studio that you work for. Okay, my next technique is the lattice deformer. Not related to spinach in any way. The lattice deformer is primarily it's a rigging tool, but it's a lot of those tools are very useful for modeling as well. And it is actually in the modeling workflow. How you'll see here, modeling, and we have my deform options right here. So I'm going to leave my helix here because he's cool. I like my helix. I'm going to put a cylinder in my helix to really try to make something advanced here. Let me hold my control here so I have control of both of my axes. There we go. Alright. So I'm going to increase how many divisions I have on this. So I have enough geometry to work with here. Give me a couple of caps and a little bit of subdivision axis here. Okay. So I have one little thing here. I'm actually going to grab both of these and bring them in a bit. As I select this, I now have the option to come over to my deformers, my deform technique here, and I can do a lattice deformer on this. So this is like geometry inception here, where I'm using geometry to affect other geometry. This is a lattice deformer. If I come over here to my functions, you'll see that I have a few divisions I can type in. Let's maybe do 5 by 5 by 5. Which one's my height? Let's see. I hope you're the height. Yeah, height. Alright. Maybe bump this up to 15. Here we go. Now I've got a pretty decent deformer here. Now if you right click on this deformer, you can select lattice points. So I can select this point and move it around, and you'll see how it's affecting my model, right? It's moving my model around a little bit. Okay, that's not that great. So you can also do soft select on this as well. So let's say, for instance, that you're making a tree branch with leaves on it that are all separate geometry. You can create a lattice deformer for all of those separate pieces and use that deformer to move that thing around to get your soft deformations in there to, maybe make your tree branch a little bit more jagged and wicked looking. And you see how my geometry is going along for the ride for both pieces. So it's kind of like a uniform thing that you're doing here. Let me offset my noodle here. It's got my I'm gonna call this my sci-fi noodle, since I have a helix wrapped around a cylinder. So my sci-fi noodle here has a lot of deformations now. Now my vertices are going to be messed up with this deformer. I'm not going to be able to do anything interesting with the actual model itself. Maybe I want to rotate this thing around and, do some weird stuff with it, and then I'm happy with it. But now I don't have any option to work on my model anymore besides this deformer. So you have a few options here. If you like what the deformer did, then all you have to do is click on your object. Click on it. There we go. Here. Click on your object and you can delete by type history. And then you should be able to delete your deformer. If you don't like what this deformer has done, if you've undone enough, let me undo all those operations. If you don't like what the deformer did, you can press delete and you can undo that operation. No harm, no foul, right? Okay, so that's the lattice deformer. Might be useful, might not be. Good for more organic details. But if you need to make some large changes to your model, that might be more effective for you, is the lattice deformer. Okay, moving on to the piece de resistance. This is what we call floating geometry or normal decals. It in no way has is related to decals that you would put in games, which are basically images projected onto other images, kind of like a card. This is what I call a normal decal or floating geometry, where we have geometry floating on top of other geometry to be baked into normal maps. So, if I turn off my annotations here, there we go, and I turn off my filter, looking at this model right now, this appears like it's modeled in. It looks like I modeled a hole in this thing. I can get a few head shakes there, head nods, but this looks like it's modeled in. However, it's not. This is floating on top of it as a separate piece of geometry that's just gliding over top of the surface, not connected in any way to this model at all. It has a ring around it that is parallel to this shape right here. So you'll see that this is a flat surface that I'm on top of, and the surface that I extruded off of this is a flat surface. Now the way that these 3D programs work, let me rotate my lighting around here. The way that these 3D programs work is it's showing you what the normals of those faces are doing and what they look like. If both of those normals look the same, then I'm not getting any visual cutoffs there. This is how Substance and 3D programs bake normal maps as well. So, if this was in the high-res mesh if this was in my high-res mesh, but not in my game res mesh, if this was just left as a flat face in my game res, this would bake into the normals of that mesh. So I've essentially punched a hole in my model with the normal maps on my game mesh. And you can go more sophisticated with that. This screw right here, although it's a little less apparent with my shader here and my lighting, but this is a decal that I had baked into my mesh that I did in no way have to model into that mesh and ruin the geometry of it and the surface. I still have a clean surface behind this that does not disrupt the rest of my model by having this baked on, or this geometry decal on top of. Now I'm going to take some time here to switch over to my game mesh to show you how this bake came out, just to reassure you and give you some good feelings inside on how this thing came out. So this is my game mesh. This is how my normal map's baked on there. You can see my booleans that baked in there. Pretty fancy. I probably could have used another edge loop right here to round this out, but that's just me being picky. Here's my hole in all its glory. Baked in there, no seam at all. Just floating geometry on top of my game mesh, baked this in there. Now my envelope had to be big enough for it to receive that information and capture it. So do make sure that you make your decals shallow, as normal maps don't really bake depth, they just bake what they see. So if you scale your work down in the Z depth of what it's baking onto, it should still resemble the same thing. So you try to have some nice shallow decals. Here's my screw that baked on there. Fairly seamless. I'm seeing a little bit of a rim around this, but nothing crazy. So it might be even something that I can paint out inside Substance, right? So I did not have to model any of that in there. That's that crease of separation I was talking to you guys about actually having a hole there that makes this thing look like it's going into a hole. Here's some more of my booleans, those fancy guys. I have some holes here on the side that were decals, my floating geometry, baked into the mesh, looking golden. Didn't have to punch a hole in nothing. It was just a cylinder that was floating on top of it with an extruded edge around it. Pretty fancy. So here's kind of a diagram of how this works. Like I said, if this flap right here is parallel to the surface that it's baking onto, then the way that your normal maps are being captured right here, if there's nothing visible there for the model to actually see, then it just bakes it as it is. It just shows you what it sees, which is the same technique that you guys use when you're tapering your details in. You guys all know that you have to taper your holes in a little bit with your mesh. When you're cutting holes inside your models, that you have to taper that in a little bit so that there's a sidewall for your normal map to bake into. If I cut a hole in something, if this is the surface of something right here, if I cut a cylinder hole into this and leave it completely straight, then the way that normal map bakes onto that flat surface will not be able to see this flat wall here because there's no taper. There's no visible sidewall for it to bake onto. So in essence, when you bake this, if you bake a hole like this, you're not going to see anything there because it is a straight detail with no depth in it. However, if you do taper your details in, you get a sidewall in there that bakes into your mesh. So it works both ways, and you take advantage of these baking techniques as much as possible. Here's another situation where I've taken two shapes together and I've baked them and made a floating decal that extruded off of my cylinder. So let's say I had a long pole that was stabbing into a surface that was flat. And what I did was I took that long pole, the cylinder, I extruded the geometry off of that pole, and then I extracted that geometry off to make a little tiny hole that would bake onto that surface. In my game mesh, what this would look like is this right here. It would just be a cylinder penetrating into the model. Okay? That's what the game mesh looks like. But in the high res, if we have this decal there, I'll have a crease. These two right here are both the same exact cylinder stabbing into one mesh in the game mesh. This cylinder did not have a card, so this is what penetrating geometry looks like when it bakes. I mean, you can see the geometry clearly there. There's no smoothness, there's no depth to that hole. It's just there. This is a cylinder that had the decal baked onto it first, and now the cylinder stabbed into it. So you'll see how this baked, how it made this crease there, and how it actually looks like there's a button that's being inserted into a flat surface. Now the downside to floating decals is you do have to name that floating geometry the same name that you do the surface in order for you to use the match by name baking option inside Substance. If you guys don't know what that feature is yet, then I will show that to you inside the Substance lecture in week 3. Or actually it's week 2, the Substance lecture. But the match by mesh name feature inside Substance is a very powerful tool that tells Substance to only bake things that are named the same thing. So you can say that you have, let's call this box right here, box underscore low and box underscore high for the high and the low mesh, and it will only bake the box onto another box. But if you do have floating geometry on top of that, what you have to do is combine that geometry together and then name it box. Okay, it's pretty simple. If this cylinder is a separate piece that you don't want to bake onto your box, then you need to make sure you extract that decal off of that cylinder so you use it as a separate piece of geometry that can combine onto the box. Very complicated stuff. It's a lot to explain. And hopefully visuals will do you a little bit more service when I get to the other lecture for you there. Here is another technique that I use together. I've combined two tools together to create a curved floating geometry decal for this. What this is basically a pin for a handle, like a cleaver or a knife or something. Since the floating geometry decal has to be parallel to the surface that it's baking onto, you have to make sure it's going to be a little tricky for you to make something parallel to a curved surface With the other decals that I've showed you so far, those have been on flat surfaces that I've only had to extrude out a little bit to get a parallel surface. This is a curved surface, so what I've done here is I've taken this curved handle and I've booleaned a cylinder into that so I can get the curvature down. I've then taken that boolean, just the edge faces there, and I've extruded off of that to create my creases and make that little creased boolean there. So this surface in retrospect here is parallel to the handle that is right here. So this should bake as a crease onto that handle in your game mesh as normal map information. Okay, so this is my last slide here that I'm going to go through. It's about cleaning your model up when you're even in the high mesh. If you're inserting edge loops like holding edges and bevels into your model, please make sure that you collapse that geometry down before it runs around your whole model. If I leave a lot of this geometry unchecked before I smooth my model, I'm going to get a lot of unnecessary holding edges, a lot of messy geometry that I have no idea how to control afterwards. It makes a lot of problems even in the high mesh when everyone creates holding edges and edge loops like this without cleaning things up. So this is what I mean by collapsing and cleaning things up, is you'll see that I've taken those edges and I've collapsed them down into one vertice, so I get one little triangle right here that ends that whole process and keeps all of this in here nice and clean. Okay? You want to be able to do this in your models. Keep your work clean. Do this operation as you work on your models. Rarely anything you do inside Maya and Substance requires no cleanup at all. You have to clean up most of the work that you do inside Maya because each tool has a level of destruction that kind of affects other models. So please make sure you're cleaning things up, you're optimizing your workflow and your edge flow as well. My last technique over here is just a little something that we'll be doing inside Substance, but what I would like for you to do in order to preserve geometry and UV space and texture resolution, what we would like you to do is to close off holes as much as possible a significant way. What we're looking at here is the inside of a gun barrel, and the way that we have this modeled out is we have a closed off hole that ends that inner barrel up very abruptly. Most likely behind the front sight of the gun barrel is where I recommend people to close things off. But what you'll be doing inside Substance once you start texturing this thing is you will create a darkness that will cancel out all lighting information and make it seem like a hole. So if you do have any gaps in your model, please do close that off and so that we can create that abyss effect and create that shadow that's in here. But that's pretty much all I have to say about this lecture and what I've gone through so far. Please message me if you're confused about anything. Please let me know if you need a demonstration in any way that exceeds what I've already shown you. Like I said, you have links to my assets here. If you go to my drill, to my game res, or my high res, sorry. If you go to my high res game mesh, you'll see these little numbers here. And what these numbers are called annotations. If you click on that number, it'll show you a specific camera view that I have set up and a little description of what I'm saying there. So please do check out those annotations. I have some for creases of separation, for beveling, and for the floating geometry decals. So please give this a look over. Look over other students' work to see how far they've gone, what they've used to create that effect, how high res you can get, and how optimized you can get with a model. As you've seen in my game mesh, I've tried to keep this fairly optimized and only contribute geometry to areas that affect the silhouette of my model. So if I do have holes or various features that don't affect the silhouette, whichever way I move it, or the forms, then that geometry is not efficient enough. I've combined all of this together so it's not separate pieces anymore, and I've used penetration as much as possible to get the effect that I need. So if you need to get effects, please do try to work in this workflow here and try to plan your assets out as far ahead of time as possible. That pretty much wraps up my modeling lecture. Like I said, please message me if you have any questions, and I look forward to seeing your models.